All right. So just a little roadmap of where I'm going with this today. I'm going to give a brief history of fire in the Sierra Nevada, especially the people. I'm going to talk a little bit about fire regimes, fire rotations, and how we think about sort of the ecological role of fire as it pertains to the Sierras, the natural range of variation of fire, and how we know when we're departing from that and going away from what's normal. Then I'm going to present the results of a recent study we did on the Sierras and fire, wildfire and burned area, and particularly the fire severity patterns. And finally, talk about the management and prospects of the implications of management implications of that study and prospects for the future and how we think about this going forward. So with respect to the history, first talking about sort of the interplay between climate, geography, vegetation, and the role of fire in the system. The Sierras is part of this gray area, the North American Mediterranean climate zone, one of 5 such zones, Mediterranean zones across the globe, and these are all fire-adapted ecosystems that are characterized by cool, wet winters and warm, dry summers. And what that means is you've got vegetation growth kind of early on in the growing season. It dries out late when it's warm and when it's and that creates fuel. And then ignitions, sort of a natural source of ignitions, lightning happens at the end of that growing season. So it's a perfect relationship for things to burn. The fuels are cured. And because of the topography of the Sierras and sort of the complex, oftentimes this is on the western side of continents, so you've got tectonics going on, and so you've got really varied topography, and it creates a mosaic of fire systems. And so you have fires burning in certain valleys and then separated from other places, and so this real kind of patchwork of different times since last fire creates lots of habitat, and so that's also responsible for the high biodiversity that you find in these Mediterranean systems. And so with respect to the Sierras, we know basically from evolution and phenology, or basically the study of how plants and animals respond in a cyclic way to the seasons. And so that's things like bud break, that's fruit production, flower production, when things go dormant. The fire's been part of this landscape for 100,000 years or more. The earliest actual evidence we have of that is about 17,000 years ago as far as charcoal and lake beds, and we know that sort of fire, the regularity of fire in the ecosystem. And there's evidence of indigenous fire going back about 9,000 years in the Sierras. So Native Americans have been managing fire in the system for a long time as well. And if we look at this is basically kind of climate graphs from 4 different places in the Sierras. And so what these are, we've got the months going along the horizontal axis, and the solid lines are the temperature, so it gets hottest in the middle of the summer. And the dotted lines is the precipitation. Most of that's coming as snowfall in the winter time. But you can see it all kind of, it's driest and it's hottest at the same time. And so that's when that curing happens of the vegetation, and we get our fires at kind of the end of that period typically. In the late summer and early fall. This map over here, this outline of the Sierras, this is a map of lightning frequency per unit area. And so the most frequent lightning is in that dark area. And the reason I show this is because it represents the interplay between ignition limited systems and fuel limited systems. And so places where you have a lot of lightning, the thing that is limiting fire in those systems is how much fuel is accumulating over time. In places where you have very little very little natural ignitions, that fuel is building up and it's staying there, and it's waiting for the chance for lightning, for something to basically a spark to get it going. And that's sort of the backdrop before humans are on the landscape, and the patterns of fire. The other thing is, as these darker areas where lightning is more common, that's also higher elevation. So you're getting shorter fire seasons, but more sources of ignitions. Yes. Let's see. Okay, sorry. So you're right about there. Yeah, and there's another map coming in just a second. And so this is a rough generalization sketch of how the vegetation types kind of play out across the Sierras, kind of east to west, and going up in elevation here. And the most sort of productive part of the Sierras is this yellow pine, lodgepole, red fir area in there, and it's because there's more rainfall on the western side, it's a little lower. The growing conditions are a little bit better, drier, and higher on the east side, the Owens side. This yellow pine area is also this is divided. This is also a bigger area of what's basically the yellow pine mixed conifer. So it's you'll see as I break this area down, it starts, the lowest area is dry mixed conifer, moist mixed conifer, and yellow pine, and that's just a reference, but it's all more or less this kind of mixed conifer and productive forest area. So I break down the sort of the humans and fire history in the Sierras in 4 general groups. You could slice it and dice it in a bunch of different ways. But the first area is the kind of the indigenous pre-Euro-American settlement area before the gold rush. Then there's the gold rush area up until about the early 1900s when the Forest Service was established. Then from that establishment through the 1960s, which was basically the sort of the forest as a very productive area, but also full-on fire suppression. And then in the 1960s and onward, from when we start to realize the role of fire in the Sierras, and we also start to see the effects of fire suppression at the same time. And we get a little bit more into the scientific management of the forest and its relationship to fire. So first, in that first era, so there was frequent low-intensity fire was encouraged and managed by the various tribes. This map here is a simplification, but it does show that there's a whole bunch of different tribes that called the Sierras their ancestral lands and managed fire across that landscape. Their activities were concentrated in that really productive area, that yellow pine and mixed conifer zone. And they use fire to encourage certain food plants, to clear underbrush, to improve hunting habitat, clear meadows, for a whole bunch of different activities, including keeping communities safe from wildfires. And so they maintained a fire-resilient landscapes that were dominated by open pine forests and diverse understories in that mosaic, that patchwork of different times and severities since fire. Then with the gold rush, there was a huge influx of non-native, of Euro-Americans that came to California. There were obviously the Spanish were here in Mexico. California was part of Mexico before that, but really the land management and forest management in the Sierras was mostly natural range of variation, and also with the indigenous stewardship. And with that gold rush came a lot of resource extraction for mining, logging, high grading of the larger trees, and a full suppression of fire, both for the productivity of those forests, and they also basically suppressing the indigenous and really relegating or marginalizing the indigenous populations there and preventing them from their stewardship activities. It also saw the beginning of the first Forest Service and Federal Forest Service reserves. Gifford Pinchot and the Forest Service focus on productivity. At the same time, there was John Muir and the beginning of the conservation movement, a very different approach, but both shared in common this idea that wildfire was largely a destructive force. And we see that as the U.S. got capacity, the Federal Forest Service developed over the course of the first half of the 20th century. The big burn in Idaho, 1 million acres burned, that really got the public support behind fire suppression. It coincided with a massive influx of money into the Forest Service and the development of roads, the development of infrastructure to be able to effectively suppress forests. At the same time, it hadn't been that long since fire suppression was initiated, so it was easy to suppress fires because the fuels hadn't built up over that period of time yet. And so two things went together as far as capacity and the state of the forest allowed that suppression to be very effective. And then towards the end of that period, we start to see the negative effects of suppression. We start to see decline in forest health, increases in fire size and severity. And that gives way to the 1960s when the first kind of scientific sort of institutional recognition that science and ecology showing that fire is a natural part of that system. The Native Americans were probably shaking their head because we figured that out only a few thousand years after they did at that point. But you know, it takes a while for institutions to catch on. The late 60s show the beginning of, like in Yosemite, they allowed wildfires to burn in places where it wasn't deemed a risk to assets and to people. We see acknowledgement within sort of the importance of fire for the regeneration of things like the giant sequoia. Prescribed burning starts to become institutionalized within the Forest Service and national parks. It's still suppression policy still dominates, but prescribed fire is starting to be implemented. Same with beneficial wildfire. And then as we get into the end of the 2000s, or beginning of 2000s, we're seeing the effects of weather extremes combining with suppression and drought and longer fire seasons to see some of the beginning of these mega fires. But a wider spread recognition of the importance of fire, in these fire adapted landscapes, and the nuances of different kinds of fire. And then the effects finally of the potential changes in forest composition and structure that happens when we shift from a low and moderate severity fire to a higher severity fire properties. Oops. So just to introduce a few terms and sort of ecological concepts with respect to fire and their importance for the study I'm about to present. This idea of fire regime, it's kind of the whole ball of wax as far as fire and ecosystems in terms of the pattern of fire frequency, the intensity, and when I say intensity, I'm talking about the sort of the heat and energy is this very hot burning fires. Severity, which really relates to the mortality, especially of the overstory trees. And then the types of fire. Are these ground fires? Are these crown fires? And the function of sort of the vegetation, how the vegetation interplays with that. So certain types of vegetation create more fuels than others, and different parts. So think about the shrub layer towards the forest floor versus ladder fuels on trees that bring the fire up into the canopy. And so all those things come together to create a fire regime. And then we talk about within a fire regime, the fire return interval. So for a specific place, that just how often fire is on average coming back to that site. So around here, it might have been the background noise sort of somewhere in the order of 15 to 25 years in the Jeffrey Pine Forest. And fire rotation is a very similar concept, but it's more talking about a whole area. So you might say the Inyo National Forest, what's the fire rotation of the Inyo? And that's based also on average fire size. So it's how often those fuels are regenerating, but it's also what is the mosaic of individual fires, how big are they on average? Because in any given year, there's probably fires happening within that area. And so how long does it take for that whole area to burn with those, summing up those fires? And then this is a look, now these are the different forest types that I look at that we look at in the study. And so there's their sort of elevational range. And this is their fire rotation average. And so we're talking about somewhere on the range between, for the lower elevation stuff, between 18 and 80 years. And then as we get up into the subalpine and alpine, we get some much longer fire rotation periods. Those are much less productive forests. They're shorter growing seasons. And so that's why you get some of those longer times. But I also want to point your attention to this fire severity, last column here in bold. And so the percentage, there's always high severity fire as part of any of these fire regimes, but in general, it's very low. It's on the order of 6 to 10% for most of these, and then up into the 20s for the lodgepole forests. And this picture right here, these little arrows, this is from a stump of a Jeffrey pine, and it's basically showing you where those fire scars are every basically 4 to 16 years. And none of those fires is killing that Jeffrey pine. It's making a mark, and you can see it in the ring record. But that probably means that most of those fires are all basically, it's a stump, so it's probably on the order of 3 feet or lower in height. So those are surface fires that come through, and that Jeffrey basically is surviving all those fires because of its sort of thick bark and some of its fire adapted characteristics. Now we get into this idea of this natural range of variation. Those columns, that table in the previous slide, they show the averages of sort of how often fire returns, but there's a big range, and so we rather than give sort of a single average number, we talk about this natural range of variation. But at some point, we have to sort of figure out whether we're actually departing from that. And for these different forest types, they've created, this is from a previous study by other researchers, but basically creating a map of how long it's been since last fire and how much that is a change from the way that system is adapted to the best of our knowledge. And so these colors in blue show the areas where fire basically is much less frequent than it was historically, as far as we can estimate. And then this area in yellow, this is the coastal chaparral. This is the opposite. Fires are more frequent than they were historically, and part of that is because chaparral is a fast growing and also experiences is very drought adapted. But there was very little lightning in the chaparral system. Well, there still is very little lightning, but now humans live in this area, and so there's a lot of sources of ignition. This is one of those ignition limited landscapes, and now there's a lot of ignitions. Whereas the opposite is the case in the Sierras. And so we're seeing areas that are basically up to 5 times basically 5 intervals of fire return intervals have gone by without a fire in some of these forests. So that's an accumulation of the fuels, which are priming it for high severity fire. The other thing that's happening is we're getting increased density of small diameter trees as the shade intolerant trees kind of drop out of the landscape because there's no fire opening it up. And so we get these white firs and incense and cedars, an increase in the ladder fuels from these different species that are filling in. And so that's a pathway to canopy fires rather than surface fires. And so finally, with climate, hotter, drier summers and longer fire seasons, sort of putting together this kind of perfect storm for more fire and hotter fire and higher severity fire that is going to be less patchy because you've got this continuity of fuels across the landscape. Oh, okay, here we go. So this is the beginning of this of the study that I did with collaborators, and here's the sort of study area. So it goes beyond the Sierras up into the Southern Cascades. And so what we did is we looked at fire, basically compared fire since 1984 wildfires to 2020 in the area, and we compared it to this estimate of the background estimate of how much fire was in the Sierra landscape basically prior to Euro-American colonization, before that 1850, right? And so on average, in a given year, over 200,000 hectares or 500,000 acres of forest was burning every year. Most of that was burning at low to moderate severity. So it wasn't the crazy smoke that we experienced like in 2020 here in Mammoth with the Creek Fire, but the smoke was probably a regular part of the landscape for much of the summer and fall in the Sierras because a lot of areas was burning. And so now, as you can see, we didn't even come close to matching that background level of fire in any given year until 2020. And so we're still way under on average as far as how much area is burning. It's just a different kind of fire. It's this low. The fire that we're having is high severity fire, but the total number of acres that are burning are way below basically wants to happen in a natural range of variation landscape. So a previous study looked at sort of the ratio of how much is burning and how much of it is high severity fire, looking at from 1984 to 2009. But then we had a whole decade plus of really big fires, and so that was what motivated us to come back and reanalyze this data. And so this is a little bit of a complex graph, but if you think about on the left side is the percentage of that pre-1850 fire. So this is that background level of indigenous fire that was going on in the landscape, and the bars represent how much of that, how much of the landscape was burning in that first period of 84 to 2009, and the orange bars are from that last 2010 to 2020. And so you can see in each of these is all the forests combined, and this is the different types of forests across the way. But as you can see, there's a big jump in the amount of fire that's happening just since 2010. So we're still way below what that kind of background Native American pre-Euro-American colonization threshold is, but there's a big jump. Now the dots represent the total number of acres or hectares that are burned, and so that's this axis on the right-hand side, and you can see that as a number just in sheer area that we're also experiencing a big jump in the last since 2010, and that's across all the different forest types. So this is breaking it down. Now this is jumping into the severity, and so this is it's a little bit complex, but basically the blue bars are low to moderate severity fire, and the orange is high severity fire. And so these green arrows point to what it was, the background level. This is the pre-colonization levels balance of low to moderate severity fire compared to high severity fire. And so for all forests combined, we were at about 7%. About 7% of all of fire was high severity fire. If we look at 2010, we're now at roughly 35%. So that's 5 times more high severity fire now than the forests are adapted to, as far as we can tell looking at the records. And if you break down this by different forest types, as you go from left to right, this is going up in elevation. So oak woodland at the low end, and then through this conifer belt, this yellow pine mixed conifer belt, that's where the biggest differences are. And then as you get up into the red fir and beyond, the higher elevations, we're actually now, those are longer fire return intervals, and we're actually closer to what the background or natural range of variation differences is between. So you see that, for example, in the lodgepole pine, the pre-Euro-American settlement fire is more or less the same level as it is in 2010. So really this is affecting the central, the productive yellow pine mixed conifer, and we're seeing that basically that 5 times more high severity wildfire for that area. This combines with basically the flip side of that is a lack of low and moderate severity, a lack of the good fire that we're hoping for, or sort of that really is what the forests are adapted to, especially in these lower elevation forests. So in that mixed conifer and in the oak woodland forest, these gray bars are the natural range of variation levels we guess, and our low to moderate severity fire is way below where we really want it to be. So we're really an excess of high severity fire and a lack of the kind of good fire that we're hoping for. As you get into the higher elevation forests, that difference is less pronounced again. It's adapted to more high severity fire, and the levels are a little bit closer to what the natural range is. Looking at this in terms of area burned, this was kind of the standout point from the study, was that for the first time in that period of 2010 to 2020, we have more than twice the area on average, annual area burning at high severity than the Sierra ecoregion is adapted to, as far as we can tell, sort of looking at historic fire. And most of that increase is, again, concentrated in that yellow pine mixed conifer area. So we're seeing a lot more high severity fire and not nearly as much of the low severity kind of good fire that the vegetation and the system is adapted to. And that's where we're risking things like type conversion or real changes in structure and composition of those forests. So just kind of to summarize these points, so in this 37-year period that we looked at, annual area burned across the Sierras is still way below what we think of as the background level, but it is increasing, and it is increasing in the form of mostly in the form of high severity fire, which is not really what we're after. That percentage of high severity fire is increasing for 6 of the 7 forest types, on average about 5 times, especially in that most productive area, 5 times what we think of as the background level of high severity fire as a percentage. The yellow pine is over these 2 periods that we looked at, and sort of splitting that 1984 to 2020 period, it's relatively stable as a percentage, but it is growing in terms of overall area. So yeah, passing the historical level of high severity fire for the first time in that 2010 to 2020. And conversely, again, a lack of low severity fire to which a lot of these systems are adapted to, and a lack of smaller fires. So we're getting much bigger fires, so we're not getting those mosaics that characterize the landscape before Euro-American settlement. And this is just kind of a breakdown of trends. So the dotted lines are sort of where you would think of as the background, the natural range of variation levels. So total annual area burned is above that background in sort of across the board. High severity area, likewise. Low severity area is increasing, but the low severity percentage at that very far is less than we want. So this is just sort of how we're trending. So this is sort of over that 37-year study period. And finally, just kind of to think about some of the implications of this as far as for management and sort of how we think about the forest. The good fire gap is really pronounced. So we really need to work at different approaches to getting sort of that low to moderate severity of fire back on the landscape. And that by doing that will hopefully lower the likelihood of high severity fire. Especially in those productive areas, which are the yellow pine mixed conifer area, which also happens to be this wildland urban interface, the WUI area. So the difficulty is where people live, and is also, people have a natural aversion to fire around their houses, but that's also the area where we really need to get fire back in. The fire, we're really not making headway as far as how much we're getting burned every year. So that those fire return intervals are actually increasing. So they're going up from that 5 times sort of or 2 to 5 times the natural fire return interval that I showed earlier. Higher elevation forests, maybe is the silver lining of good news, that they're less departed from the natural range of variation, and they're less sort of showing a real movement away from that natural range of variation. That's in part because they're less productive. That's in part because they have longer fire return intervals to begin with, so their departure from normal, even with 100 years of fire suppression, is less pronounced for that system. And then finally, they happen to be often in remote high elevation areas that aren't really threatening human settlements, and so often fires are they're allowed to burn in some of these higher elevation forests, and so that's also part of the reason you're not seeing that departure. Yeah, the punchline is we really need more fuel treatments, that beneficial fire, which is prescribed fire, cultural fire, sort of picking up some of those indigenous practices that were lost, and wildfire for resource benefit, where wildfire is deemed not a threat to human settlements. Can we let it burn? Can we get some of the benefits? Even though it's mixed, there'll be some high severity fire. Can we allow it to burn in certain places where we can get some of the positive benefits of wildfire? because climate trends are basically they're continuing to go in the same direction as far as warmer, drier temperatures and longer fire seasons, reduced snowpack. And so with that combined, we really need basically also a year-round effort. So the seasonality of fire, sort of fire prevention force is probably not going to cut it given all the conditions that are sort of conspiring together. And then finally, sort of it begs for some innovative approaches. And so there's this concept of pyrosilviculture and some sort of really using sort of the natural patterns of fire and across the ecosystem and thinking about ways to use fire in management. I'll show another slide right after this, how do we incorporate fire into the management priorities rather than just kind of as an afterthought? So one of the ways is sort of leveraging the wildfire footprint. So after those wildfires have burned through, this is a severity map of the Dixie Fire, where red is high severity fire and the other colors are low to moderate severity fire. And so you can see, even though the Dixie Fire, which burned almost 1 million acres and a lot of it at high severity, was incredibly destructive, it had a lot of good sort of fire effects in the non-high severity areas. So can we use those effects, such as areas like here, where you've got basically areas that are surrounded by black areas, to get prescribed fire or allow fire to burn in a sort of, it's more protected. We don't have to worry so much about fire escapes with prescribed fire, or sort of these islands, these little spots that basically fire burned all around it. So there's really not a threat of getting prescribed fire back in there. Or can we use these landscapes, these strategic fire zones, where we are basically, if you think about the human assets and settlements in red here, can we do basically an increasing or sort of treatments more intensely around where people are and where other sort of priority landscapes are, and then phase that down so as you get to more open areas where there's less dense population, can we let wildfire burn with a little bit more, still we're trying to limit high severity fire, but we're not getting the job done with prescribed fire. And so can we basically protect certain areas and then basically create buffers so we get more comfortable with wildfire? And we've got some local talent that's helped develop those strategies here on the Inyo and around this area. So yeah, this is meeting this challenge is sort of the enormity of the acres that need to be treated. We have to be innovative. And with that, yeah, I guess that wraps it up. And I think we have some time for questions. So yeah, thanks for listening.